Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something that's honestly fascinating, but yeah, a little bit unsettling too. We're going to look closely at the unseen internal mechanics that manipulators use to literally bypass your logic and quietly control your mind. I'm super excited to guide you through this because truly understanding these hidden patterns, it's absolutely the best way to protect your own mental space. Let's get right into it. So let's start with a situation we've probably all been in. You know that feeling when you walk away from a conversation where you started off with a totally valid point, but by the end of it, you're just confused? Or you suddenly feel inexplicably guilty, like somehow you are in the wrong? It's so frustrating. Well, you might think it was just a simple misunderstanding, but psychology actually suggests that this confusing, guilty feeling, it's no accident. You were likely targeted by hidden mechanisms designed specifically to bypass your logical thinking. It's literally a hacked psychological pattern. To understand exactly how this psychological trap is built and sprung, we'll walk through these 5 key phases together in this explainer. We'll start with the psychology of control, then look at setting the bait, weaponizing your empathy, triggering cognitive overload, and finally, wrap up with how you can actually protect yourself. Okay, kicking things off with Part 1, the psychology of control, and why this kind of manipulation actually works in the first place. Here's the thing you have to remember. Manipulators don't use magic. They don't have some crazy superpower. Instead, they just exploit the very systems your brain naturally relies on every single day. Think of your brain like a highly advanced security system that's constantly scanning for safe spaces and safe people. Manipulation is really just the act of someone figuring out your passcode and sneaking into your mind without your permission. Which brings us to Part 2, setting the psychological bait, or creating that really intense early obsession. This all starts with something called the mere exposure effect. Now, this is a well-documented psychological phenomenon where our brains just naturally prefer things simply because they're familiar. And manipulators totally leverage this to lower your defenses. They intentionally make themselves this constant, reliable presence in your life, building this picture of the world where they are your primary source of comfort. Because your brain literally equates that familiarity with psychological safety, you eventually just stop questioning their motives. Their presence becomes a habit, and your logical guard completely drops. And once they've become familiar, they trigger a dopamine cycle that honestly works exactly like a slot machine in a casino. Let's walk through it. First, they shower you with intense validation and attention right out of the gate. This makes your brain mistake their potential for reality. Second, an imagined future gets built in your mind based on this really deep connection. But then, bam, step 3 happens. That validation is abruptly withdrawn. The attention just stops. And this forces step 4, where your brain is left frantically chasing that initial dopamine hit. You aren't actually chasing the reality of the person anymore. You're just chasing the chemical payout they gave you in the beginning. Moving on to Part 3, weaponizing empathy and fear. This is where they really start exploiting your deepest insecurities. Look, if you're the kind of person who finds it easier to forgive others than to forgive yourself, you are a prime target here. Manipulators who, let's be real, are often emotionally immature people desperate to protect their own egos, practice this severe kind of responsibility shifting. Whenever a mistake happens, they look for someone else to blame. They will continuously push that blame onto you until you start internalizing this incredibly destructive thought, I am the problem, instead of just realizing, hey, they made a mistake. They are literally taking your high empathy and using it as a tool so they never have to take responsibility for their own actions. To make this control even deeper, they need to get inside your psychological fortress. Most of us work super hard to hide our biggest insecurities, our deepest fears, our painful regrets, right? Because vulnerability feels really dangerous. But a manipulator will actually encourage you to rapidly take off that social mask. They'll act like the ultimate, non-judgmental, safe listener. But make no mistake, they are gathering intelligence. Once they know what makes you tick and what you're afraid of, they can weaponize your fear of rejection later on. They make you highly compliant just so you can avoid the emotional pain they now know exactly how to inflict. When you map their tactics directly to your vulnerabilities like this, a pretty terrifying picture emerges. Constant familiarity targets your core need for safety. That intense validation, it completely hacks your dopamine loop. Shifting the blame weaponizes your natural empathy, and acting as a safe listener targets your deep-seated fear of rejection. It's not an accident. It is a systematic, highly calculated exploitation of your natural human desires for connection and reward. Which leads us to Part 4, triggering cognitive overload, or what we can call the lockdown phase. Psychology shows us that under stress, the brain basically stops thinking about long-term patterns and just zeroes in on immediate survival. And manipulators know this perfectly well. They'll purposefully introduce constant stress, dial up the emotional intensity, and manufacture totally unnecessary drama exactly when you're already tired or overwhelmed. By doing this, they rapidly drain your mental energy and force your brain right into survival mode. You literally lose the biological bandwidth to even think strategically about what's happening to you. This leads directly to cognitive overload. When you're stuck in that manufactured survival mode, your mentally depleted mind is just desperate to avoid any more complex decisions. You're completely exhausted by the emotional chaos, so your brain just looks for the absolute easiest, fastest way to find a little peace in the moment. And in a manipulated relationship, the easiest way to stop the drama and catch your breath is to just do exactly what the manipulator wants. And just like that, the trap snaps shut. Finally, let's look at part 5. How to protect yourself and actually escape this trap. Your absolute best defense mechanism requires a fundamental shift in how you process relationships. You've got to move away from passive observation, which is really just listening to a person's words and taking them at face value. Instead, transition to context building. You need to zoom out, look at the whole overarching pattern of their behavior over time. Words can be so easily manipulated to sound comforting or agreeable, but a long-term pattern of behavior, that rarely lies. By really understanding the unseen patterns we've talked about today, those dopamine loops, the empathy traps, the cognitive overload, you're already building a massive defense system for yourself. When you grasp the deeper, hidden psychology behind everyday behavior, you stop taking toxic behavior so personally. You begin to see human nature in a totally different light, and you start noticing those small, calculated things that shape people's actions, the red flags that most people completely overlook. So these unseen patterns are completely visible to you now. The big question is, will you remain a passive observer, just trusting words over actions? Or are you ready to start context building so you can protect your mind and your emotional energy in real time? Remember, this trap only works in the dark. What you do with the light is entirely up to you.